let's be real. We all knew that the Elbaph flashback was going to be heavy, especially after finding out the family drama between the half-brothers with messy race relations. It was pretty obvious from very early on in the Elbaph arc that this wasn't just going to be simply Viking aesthetics and cool giant warriors. It was going to be about legacy, betrayal, and the cost of trying to change a culture built on strength and pride. But even still, what we probably didn't expect, or at least not this soon, was just how far-reaching and how complex this story would be. That this wouldn't be just a flashback centering around Elbaph's royal family, but something that potentially rewrites the entire power structure for the final saga, revealing lore that completely changes how we view the history of the One Piece world. It's about the moment that the world government reached its hand into one of the most ancient and independent warrior kingdoms of the world and shattered it from the inside. There are so many things going on that this flashback has to address. So today we're going to walk through everything we know and everything we might expect from the Elbaph flashback, from the origins of Elbaph's warrior culture to the strange renewed peaceful reign of King HARALD, and ultimately the bloody day of his death. From Loki's fall from grace, the presence of Shanks and Gaban, and how even Rox D. Zebek fits into this all. But before we begin, please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate your help in getting to 100,000 subscribers. And in return, I'll make sure that you never run out of One Piece content. And now with that said and done, let's begin. So the first thing I want to address is the world government relationship. This was a very interesting and unexpected revelation because everything we had known about Elbaph up to this point had suggested that Elbaph was unaffiliated with the world government. And then in fact this was even explicitly confirmed quite early on in the Elbaph arc. So then to receive hints that the so-called benevolent king of Elbaph, the greatest king that this nation has ever seen, had potentially been dealing with the world government, that obviously cast a lot of doubt on King HARALD. Based on dialogue from Shamrock and Summers in previous chapters, it did seem like there was a pre-existing, perhaps an even amicable relationship between the king and the members of the Holy Knights. And then more recently, Imu talked about HARALD's failure, and this to me suggested that HARALD failed to uphold his part of the bargain, suggesting the notion that there was some sort of deal between the two, which to me also kind of feels similar to how Imu talks about Lily, Nefertari Lily's mistake when she accidentally, or so-called accidentally, disseminated the poneglyphs across the world. And Imu questions, was this an actual blunder or was that intentional? And I think most fans would assume the latter, especially given that Lily is a member of the D family. So then when Imu talks about HARALD's failure, I can't help but also wonder, is this a similar scenario? Did HARALD really fail, or was this part of his own intentional thought out plan? And then chapter 1152 essentially confirms that HARALD indeed was dealing with the world government, going to Marijois for discussions, as well as Loki's comments about his dad working with the world government. Now Loki's hatred for the world government and the fact that Elbaph is heading in that direction does seem to be primarily out of his hatred for what the world government did to his idol Rox, or alternatively, or at least in addition, it could also be that he's unsatisfied about the peace reformation going on at Elbaph, because it does seem that this peace reformation may somehow be linked to HARALD working with the world government. When Yrul says that he's too old to be dealing with politics, Loki accuses that sort of attitude to be the reason or to be part of the problem, making a connection between Elbaph's cooperation with the world government to the changes and the transformation at Elbaph, as well as what happened to Rox. In which case, with this Rox connection, it's hard not to consider the native hunting competition which took place at God Valley, which is also obviously where the God Valley incident took place, and also just so happened that during this incident, or at least during the competition, there were several prizes that were being offered to the winner, and a number of these prizes were legendary special devil fruits. And then given that a legendary special devil fruit is a key element within the King HARALD story, I can't help but wonder, does this somehow relate? So let's actually unpack that legendary special devil fruit in greater detail. We know that the royal family of Elbaph are in possession of a special, or were in possession of a special devil fruit that has been passed down the generations. Interestingly, by some accounts, it's known as the forbidden devil fruit, whereas in other cases, it's just known as the legendary devil fruit. And I do wonder what that suggests. In any case, this special devil fruit got stolen 14 years ago, or at least someone attempted to steal it 14 years ago, because we see in the flashback someone snuck in during the attack on King Harold to take possession of that prized family heirloom. And according to the Elbaphians, Loki is believed to have killed his own father in cold blood just to take possession of those legendary powers. Whereas you'll know that I've believed in Loki's innocence from the get-go. However, I am willing to believe, or think that it is even still likely, that despite his innocence, Loki did end up consuming that prized devil fruit. Primarily because we do know for sure that Loki has consumed the devil fruit. After all, he's being tied up with sea stone cuffs to curb his strength and his power, and there have been numerous mentions about how these cuffs have been holding him back physically. Unless he is just tricking everyone about that, seeing as the original Norse god that Oda has obviously modeled him after is known as the god of trickery, god of cunning, god of mischief, so he could have just been lying this entire time when the sea stones don't have any effect on him, which means that he's effectively pulling a hold me back just to not actually have to fight. And then you'd have to wonder why he had been willingly captured and why he would take the abuse at the hands of the Holy Knights. Is it just to keep the secret hidden? Maybe because the fruit is out there and he doesn't want the Holy Knights or anyone to find out, so he's just been enduring it for Elbaph's sake? Which I can see the arguments for, but if we follow the more straightforward thinking, let's assume he does currently have some devil fruit powers, in which case the Elbaphians would only believe that Loki consumed the devil fruit, that legendary Elbaphian devil fruit, if he didn't already have his own devil fruit powers to begin with, because aside from Blackbeard's abnormality, as far as we know, you shouldn't be able to consume more than one devil fruit. Now, of course, Loki could be a special case very much like Blackbeard, but again, I don't think we want to make things any more complex than they already are, so let's just assume he has one devil fruit power. And in that case, I have two interpretations. First, Loki did end up consuming that legendary devil fruit that has been part of his family for as long as anyone can remember, but he only did so because he didn't want to see the devil fruit falling into the wrong hands. Those hands being most likely the detestable world government, quite likely one of the Holy Knights. And if killing King Harold was something he had to do, which we will get into later, then he also knew that he needed the strength of that legendary devil fruit, because that would be the only way he could defeat his all-powerful, super strong father. Alternatively, Loki never consumed that legendary devil fruit, and the fruit did in fact get stolen. However, because Loki had acquired another devil fruit whilst on his travels, remember in chapter 1152, it does seem like Loki is returning to Elbaph after a voyage elsewhere. But because he has been away, the Elbaphians just simply didn't know that Loki had already gained a devil fruit whilst on his travels. So in the aftermath of that brutal murder where the Elbaphians discovered their king dead, the devil fruit missing, whereas Loki was still all-powerful and mighty, they just jumped to the conclusion that Loki must have killed his own father in pursuit of that devil fruit. And if that's true, then the question obviously arises, who then currently has that special devil fruit? Because that is potentially major bad news if it has indeed fallen into the wrong hands. What sort of monster are we going to be faced up against for the final saga? But I also have some other questions about the significance of that devil fruit in general. I mean, firstly, what is its connection to Nika? This special devil fruit seems to be linked to the sun god in some way, which is very interesting given that we know that Luffy's devil fruit is the sun god Nika devil fruit. And yet, several characters seem to link this Elbaphian devil fruit to the sun god Nika. My second question is, why was this special devil fruit not being consumed by the Elbaphians and just simply being passed down the generations? And I guess, sort of relatedly, another question is, why is it known as the forbidden devil fruit? This feels very similar to the treatment of the tamatebako and the energy steroids at Fishman Island. These were also considered the national treasure of the Fishman Kingdom, but at the same time it was treated as something quite dangerous, something that needed to be guarded, something that needed protecting, something that shouldn't be misused. And my guess is, just as the energy steroids had the power to make someone someone super strong. A devil fruit of these proportions, of this legendary status, that must also give someone incredible strength, incredible overpowered abilities. And that's why it's so important that neither of these fall into the wrong hands, thereby requiring guarding from the royal kingdoms of each nation. Both were entrusted to special kingdoms of special races, both of whom we know have special ties to Joy Boy or Nika. People that could be trusted to keep these safe. Very similar to how Wano, another allied kingdom, was entrusted with the safekeep of Pluton. And I'm also assuming that these special items were given to these kingdoms specifically because the idea was when the next major war erupted, when that final showdown was going to occur, that these two kingdoms should use and consume these powers so that they could gain these overpowered abilities to help them win the war that their side lost during the Void Century. And then in which case, another related question I have is, so then why now, or why 14 years ago? Why did this devil fruit become so important then? Why did the thief, whoever it was, choose that moment to steal the devil fruit? And I guess not even just the devil fruit, but why that moment to attack King Harold? And I didn't realize it immediately, but when I actually went back to do more digging on the Elbaph timeline as well as just One Piece history in general, I actually found out that 14 years ago is a pretty damn important time in One Piece history. Aside from all the stuff going on at Elbaph, there are some other events that I thought could be relevant, could be related, or at least I found interesting. So for starters, only 1 year prior to everything happening 14 years ago, it was 15 years ago that Fisher Tiger infiltrated Marijoa after he had already escaped to then go back and free the remaining slaves. And I do think that that is obviously a major hit for the world government. And then around the same time, the Nox Expedition Party, they were being chased by the world government for trying to search for the poneglyphs, which would have been another reminder for the world government that there is still remaining hope, still a remaining fight to find out the truth of the world, to uncover all of the world's secrets. And I think this could have served as further motivation for the world government to want to stamp out any sort of dissent, any sort of attempts to find out the truth. Because then 14 years ago, in the same year as King Harold's murder, that was also when Spandam finally convinced the Gorosei to give him permission to go search for Pluton, this being yet another reminder that the final war is still not settled. There are still remnants of the past that exist, people who are interested in digging it up even if they are on the side of the world government. Meanwhile, this was when the Puffing Tom was being completed, and 14 years ago also happens to be the same year that Ginny was captured. Now, I don't know if and how all of these things are related, but I can definitely see how this would have been a point in time that was giving the world government a major headache, and so they finally figured, let's just put an end to all of this truth-finding nonsense. Let's just make sure that we gather all the pieces so that we can end the war once and for all and put this to bed. And Elbaph, as an ancient kingdom with deep historical roots, as well as the possession of a legendary devil fruit that could result in a major turning point within the war, the world government could have seen it necessary to attack Elbaph then and there. And then while those external political factors are already difficult enough to deal with, there's also the matter of giant race relations that we have to address in this flashback. I know that the animosity between the giant races shouldn't really come as too much of a surprise, given that Oda did seed it with Saul's comments back in the Water 7 arc, but it did honestly surprise me how much of a critical role that was going to play in the Elbaph arc and in unpacking Elbaph's past. It's a major plot point that relates to all the secrets surrounding Harold and Loki's past, as well as for Harridan's own character development. What's interesting is that there seems to be no animosity between Elbaph towards ancient giants. We know this because both King Harold and Loki, members of the royal family, as well as a number of other Elbaphians, do have ancient giant lineage, but despite this, these members of Elbaph aren't scorned in the same way that it seems like Harridan faced when he was young, as well as the torment that his mother endured. And this leads me to wonder, is that simply because of Elbaph's warrior roots? With ancient giants being the most fearsome, largest of the giant races, this is the one other giant race that the Elbaphians respect respect and revere? Alternatively, are Elbaphians as a race as a whole, are they descendants of the ancient giant race? Meaning that ironically, Elbaphians aren't pure-blood giants themselves, but I do find it slightly less likely because there is a marked physical difference between those who are just Elbaphians versus those who do have the ancient giant lineage. Their horns are a telltale sign, but they're also colossal, much bigger than the rest of the Elbaphians. But what really interests me is how this relates to Harald's overall motivations and his actions in both potentially working with the world government as well as his peace project in Elbaph. Because we know that Harald's mother wasn't accepted by Elbaph because of their prejudice, I always assumed that meeting her and falling in love with her was a major part of Harald's motivations for embarking on his peace project. But then you have to note the time difference between when the peace reformation started to when he would have fallen in love and met Harald's mother. So according to Ripley, the transformation started or happened 100 years ago. But I don't know if that's just an approximate time frame and Ripley is just talking generally, because there are other times where it seems like the timelines just don't quite match up. For example, in the Big Mom flashback, when we see that Loki was born, i.e. only 63 years ago, we actually see that Harald is still being trained in the warrior's way. Although admittedly, he is being looked down on for being a wild child, and maybe that relates to the fact that he is still practicing violence despite the fact that Elbaph has already undergone this peaceful transformation. But then also in the mini flashback that we got earlier, when we see King Harald talking to both of his sons, now that obviously must have occurred even less than 60 years ago, maybe around 50 years ago if Loki is already a young boy by then. There we see that King Harald still has his ancient giant horns, so at which point during his reformation of Elbaph did he take out his own horns as a super symbolic gesture that he was rejecting the violent ways of Elbaph's past? And what made him do that almost 50 years halfway through the Reformation project? And I guess going back to my original observation, if Elbaph had already begun its transformation 100 years ago, when did Harald meet Harald's mother? Because Harald is only 81 years old. Because like I said, I just assumed that meeting Harald's mother was a core part of why Harald wanted to reform Elbaph. You know, maybe after he fell in love with her, she rejected him because she didn't like how brutish Elbaph was, and she didn't trust his violent ways. And maybe after falling in love with someone of another giant race, this opened up Harald's eyes to how wrong Elbaph was being for being so racist and so prejudiced. He realized that Elbaph was stuck in the past and they needed to become more open and more accepting and more progressive. And the more I think about it, I'm really liking how love-driven both Harald and Loki may actually be. Oda has already made it clear that the like father, like son dynamic is very much alive between Harald and Loki, especially before King Harald reformed. We see it in the parallels of both of them kicking their own soldiers, kicking their own men, and just their overall boisterous, loud, brutish personalities. But then it also seems like Oda may be weaving in a personality trait for both the father and son, both being suckers for love. Because even at the beginning of King Harald's flashback, it seems like Harald may have attacked an island solely on the basis that there was news that there was a pretty princess who lived on this island. And I know that the point of this intro to the old Harald is supposed to show that he's this arrogant scum, but at the same time, I can't help but laugh at the idea that in his own way, Harald may have thought that he was being a romantic. Imagine if he genuinely was just interested in finding a beautiful woman. He just wanted to find himself a woman that he could love. Because remember our introduction to Loki, long before we ever laid eyes on him, the thing that stood out most was his love for Lola. And I know that some have thought that his engagement with Lola was part of some sort of political ploy with Big Mom, but I've already shared my thoughts on that, so you can go watch that video. I'll paste the link below. The short version is, I don't buy it. I don't think it was just politics. And more importantly, I don't think the timeline quite matches up. In which case, I go back to my original point. Both Harald and Loki may just be suckers for love. Alternatively, and I guess on a bit more of a serious note, I think another reason why King Harald would have embarked on his Reformation project could have actually had to do with whatever law, whatever prophecy he believes both himself and his son Loki to be a part of. Obviously, Elbaph has deep ties to the lore of the One Piece world. They trace back to possibly longer than 3,000 years ago. They've got the Harley lore, they've got their spirituality and their belief in Nika, the sun god, and they have all of these prophecies that they do seem to take very seriously. And I think that at some point, King Harold got very studious, very spiritual. I don't know if you guys follow the Song of Ice and Fire series, if you ever watch Game of Thrones, but for those of you who will understand the reference, I'm very much getting a Rhaegar Targaryen feel from all of this. Rhaegar, as you may know, became very obsessed with the prophecy about the prince who was promised, and it was this obsession that would eventually turn the world upside down. And I'm wondering whether King Harold did the same, whether he was reading the ancient books of Elbaph one day, and he came across something that made him realize that he needed to change. He needed Elbaph to change. Sort of similar to how Odin realized that Wano would eventually need to open up its borders. Harold needed to reform Elbaph's old ways and its traditions, and that's why he decided to dedicate more funds to the school, more funds to education, the upkeep of their owl library. And it's also likely that he knew that Loki, as being the center of his own major prophecy, he knew that Loki would also be involved. And maybe that's why he even called Loki, he summoned Loki on that fateful day 14 years ago. It's interesting that both Jarl and Loki were summoned, because it raises the question of, were they actually summoned by the king himself, or was it part of a plot to frame Loki? And was it someone else that summoned these two? Either way, we already know that Loki is part of a very ominous prophecy, not just about killing his own father, but being known as the accursed prince, someone who's going to bring about the end of Elbaph, bring about the end of the world. And this is a prophecy that was widely known throughout Elbaph and then became even more believed after that fateful day. But it's also possible that King Harold believed in the prophecy as something that needed to happen for the greater good. He might have known that Loki did in fact have to kill him. He might have even requested Loki to fulfill his prophecy. And I say this because much earlier, when I was speculating on the whole conspiracy, and when we started getting hints about King Harold's relationship to world government, I started thinking that King Harold might not have been such a great king after all. Whereas now that we're getting more information about King Harold, I'm thinking that he actually was a good king, that there is actually a lot more to the picture and we're just not seeing it yet. The way that both Loki and Harald talk about their father, the fact that it even seems like Loki would rather defend his father's legacy and his memory, even if that means he has to be held captive and potentially even face execution. So I definitely think that King Harold also isn't one of the bad guys, especially after seeing that Shanks had a prior relationship with Harold, wanted to have a deeper discussion with him, the fact that the two got along at Marjoie. I think all of those are signs that King Harold is probably a good guy, and that this all is just part of a wider, bigger prophecy. And King Harold just knew that both himself and his son were just part of something bigger than themselves. And then I think this brings us to the Shanks and Gaban of it all, because that also ties into the whole prophecy and destiny considerations. Chapter 1152 pretty much confirmed that Shanks did know of Loki's innocence and yet decided to lock him up anyways. We know that 6 years ago it was Shanks that captured Loki, brought him back to Elbaph. And as I have said in the past, I did think that Shanks was part of the cover-up, and Shanks had reasons of his own, most likely those reasons being that he knew about the prophecy as well, and he knew that there was a lot more going on, and that this is all larger than just Loki, this is just larger than Harold, this is just larger than himself. It was necessary for Loki to be captured because it just wasn't yet time for Loki to be released into the world. And I will also share that video as well, so go check it out. But especially now that we know that Shanks is part of his own destiny, part of his own prophecy, it seems like these are all beginning to converge. But I do have a lot more thoughts on the whole Shanks piece, so I will discuss that in a future video, because otherwise today's video would just never end. Anyways, as I was unpacking all of this more, especially the timeline of Elbaph's history, some other things also stood out to me. It's crazy because Jarl and Jarl were both born roughly 400 years ago, whereas Oz heroes died roughly 500 years ago, and I know that that's a century in between, but that's not really a huge amount of time in terms of Elbaph or giant years, and especially seeing that Harald and Loki both have ancient giant lineage, we are probably going to find out more about the ancient giants as a race as a whole, but also about the continent puller and why and how he fits into the overall One Piece story. Also, Yrul and Yorul's age means that they were alive during the Mont Blanc, Noland, and Kalgara story when they were living out their lives on Shandora, when part of Jaya got knocked up into the sky. And given all of the connections between the special races and the special kingdoms like Elbaph, like Fishman Island, and like Shandora, I can't wait to see whether this deeper dive into Elbaphian history will also shed more light, will also give us more unexpected nuggets on other pieces of One Piece lore. And I just think it's kind of crazy that at the beginning of the Elbaph arc, I was very much expecting a Loki flashback, a Loki backstory, and what we're getting is a HARALD flashback instead. Because that's really the Odin treatment at Wano if you think about it. A full dedicated flashback spanning back a really long period of time. This is a figure that is clearly the main character of his own legendary story. This is classic Oda playbook, and I now know that we can expect another hallmark legendary character. But these are just some of my immediate thoughts on the whole King Harald flashback. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below. Please like the video, please share the video if you enjoyed today's discussion, and please do subscribe for more One Piece discussions and also to help out a fellow One Piece fan get 100,000 subscribers. You can also help support the channel further like these wonderful people by becoming a Patreon or channel member. But as always, thank you so much for listening to another one of my crazy ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.